They called her a gold digger, but she inherited the empire her mother and stepfather tried to steal. The crystal glasses caught the chandelier light, like tiny prisons of fire. Around the mahogany table sat 5 people, but only 3 spoke. The lawyers adjusted their ties. The mother dabbed invisible tears with a silk handkerchief. The stepfather leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. Clara sat perfectly still, her fingers resting on a black leather folder. Inside it, the truth waited like a loaded gun. Her mother's voice cut through the silence. "We're family. Family shares everything." The stepfather smiled, his teeth too white, his cologne too expensive. "Your grandmother would have wanted us all to be together in this." Clara didn't respond. She had learned years ago that silence was the sharpest weapon when surrounded by liars. Her voice, soft but steady, finally emerged. "For years you called me a gold digger. You said I stayed close to her for the money, that I was calculating, manipulative." She opened the folder slowly, deliberately. "But tonight, you're about to discover who the real gold diggers were all along." The air in the room changed. The lawyers exchanged glances, and Clara smiled for the first time that evening. "Before I tell you what happened that night, I want you to do something for me. Tell me where you're listening from, what city, what country, because maybe you've been called a gold digger too. Maybe you loved someone truly, while everyone around you only saw the money." "My name is Clara. I'm 24, an architect by training, though I never expected to be inheriting an empire. I grew up in my grandmother's shadow, not because she cast one of darkness, but because her light was so brilliant it illuminated everything around her. Victoria Ashford, that was her name. The woman who built a chain of luxury resorts from nothing, who turned a single beachfront property into a hospitality empire spanning 3 continents. She didn't inherit wealth. She created it, brick by brick, decision by decision, sacrifice by sacrifice. My mother, Helena, was her daughter by blood, but a stranger by choice. She left when I was 7, chasing a lifestyle my grandmother's success had made possible but that she herself had never earned. She married Rogerio, a so-called business consultant with charm that could sell ice to winter and morals that would melt in summer heat. My father died when I was 5, a heart attack at 32, sudden and cruel. After that it was just me and my grandmother, and the vast echoing spaces of a mansion that felt more like home than any place I'd been before. But everything changed the day my grandmother called me into her office, her hands folded over a sealed envelope. "This testament isn't just a gift, Clara," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "It's a test, and you don't even know yet who you're being tested against." The Ashford Empire wasn't built on luck or inheritance. It was constructed through vision, relentless work, and a refusal to accept limitations. My grandmother started with nothing. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood where dreams were luxuries most couldn't afford. But Victoria was different. She cleaned hotel rooms at 16, studied business textbooks in staff break rooms, and saved every dollar like it was a brick in a foundation she was building towards something no one else could see yet. By 25, she'd purchased her first property, a rundown beachfront lodge that everyone said was cursed. "Bad luck," they whispered. "Bad investment." She proved them all wrong. Within 5 years, that lodge became the crown jewel of coastal tourism. Within 10, she owned 3 more. Within 20, the Ashford Resort Collection was synonymous with luxury, elegance, and impeccable service. I grew up walking those properties with her. She'd run her fingers along marble countertops and mahogany railings, not with pride, but with the careful attention of someone who knew that excellence required constant vigilance. "An empire doesn't fall because of external enemies," she told me once, standing in the lobby of our flagship resort as sunset painted the ocean gold. "It falls when it's inherited by people who never paid the price to build it." Her office was my favorite room in the mansion. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive desk that had belonged to her mentor, the only person who'd believed in her when she was young. The air always smelled of old paper, coffee, and something else I could never quite name. Legacy, perhaps, or the weight of decisions that changed lives. She'd sit at that desk working late into the night, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her silver hair pulled back in a simple bun. Sometimes I'd fall asleep on the leather couch in the corner, and she'd drape a blanket over me without ever stopping her work. "You're always here," my mother said once, during one of her rare visits. The accusation in her voice was clear. "What are you trying to prove, Clara?" I'm not trying to prove anything, I replied quietly. I'm just learning. Learning what? How to be like her. Helena laughed, bitter and sharp. You think that'll make you worthy of inheriting all this? My grandmother looked up from her papers, her expression unreadable. Worthiness isn't given, Helena. It's demonstrated. My mother left early that visit, as she always did. The day my grandmother called me into her office with the testament, I knew something had shifted. She moved slower now, her hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee from her antique silver pot. Sit down, darling. I did, my heart beginning to race despite the calm in her voice. She slid a thick envelope across the desk. My name was written on it in her perfect, old-fashioned script. This contains my will, but more than that, it contains instructions. The business, the properties, the investments, all of it will be yours. Grandmother, she held up a hand. Let me finish. Your mother will contest this. She'll bring lawyers, she'll bring Rogerio, she'll bring arguments about fairness and family and legal rights. She'll say I favored you, manipulated you, poisoned you against her. But listen to me carefully, Clara. Her eyes, still sharp despite her age, locked onto mine. Inheritance isn't about what you receive. It's about what you're willing to protect. An empire survives only if it's passed to someone who understands that wealth is responsibility, not freedom. Someone who knows that legacy isn't about spending, it's about sustaining. She opened a drawer and pulled out another folder. This one thicker, heavier. What you're about to inherit isn't just money. It's proof. Proof of who really cared about this family's future and who only cared about extracting value from it. What do you mean? Her smile was sad, knowing. The people who call you a gold digger, Clara, they're always the ones searching for gold themselves. They recognize ambition because they're drowning in greed. And when this testament is read, when the truth comes out, she paused, her fingers drumming once on the desk. You'll discover that the real test wasn't whether you could run this empire. It was whether you could withstand everyone trying to take it from you. I left her office that day with the envelope, my hands shaking, my mind spinning. 2 weeks later, my grandmother had a stroke. She survived, but barely. The doctors said she had weeks, maybe a month, and that's when they came back. My mother, Rogerio, suddenly so caring, so concerned, so present. We're here for you, my mother said, hugging me with arms that felt like chains. Family needs to be together in times like these. Rogerio smiled, his hand on my shoulder, too heavy, too familiar. Don't worry about the business. I have experience in corporate transitions. We'll manage everything together. Together. That word would become their weapon. They arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days after the doctors gave their prognosis. My mother wore designer grief, a black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, pearls that caught the light with practiced elegance. Rogerio wore a suit that screamed success and sunglasses he didn't need, carrying expensive luggage for a stay that was supposed to be temporary but that I knew, instinctively, would last as long as there was something to extract. Oh, darling, my mother breathed, pulling me into an embrace that smelled of French perfume and calculation. I'm so sorry I couldn't get here sooner. You know how it is with international flights, the connections. She hadn't visited in 3 years. Rogerio set down their bags in the foyer, the same foyer my grandmother had designed herself, with imported Italian marble and a chandelier she'd purchased at an estate sale in Vienna. He looked around with the appraising eye of an auctioneer. Beautiful home, he said, though his tone suggested he was already calculating its value. Victoria always had exquisite taste. She's not dead yet, I said quietly. Of course not, of course not. He raised his hands in mock apology. Poor choice of words. I just meant, well, we're all thinking about the future now, aren't we? The future. Their future. Built on my grandmother's present. That first dinner was a masterclass in manipulation. My mother insisted on cooking, or rather directing the staff to cook, while she arranged flowers and lit candles, creating an atmosphere of warmth that felt as artificial as stage lighting. We need to discuss the business, Rogerio said over wine that came from my grandmother's private collection. The resort portfolio, the investments, the holdings. It's a lot for one person to manage, especially someone so young. I'm 24. Exactly. He smiled. The kind of smile that's meant to be reassuring, but lands as condescending. Which is why Helena and I think it makes sense to form a management collective. Family oversight. You'd still be involved, of course, but with proper guidance. My grandmother left specific instructions. Instructions written when she was healthy, my mother interjected smoothly. But circumstances change. She'd want us to adapt, to be practical. She'd want us to be united. United. Another word that would become a knife. My grandmother, in her hospital bed, watched this unfold with eyes that saw everything. She couldn't speak well anymore, the stroke having stolen her words, but her gaze was sharp, knowing. When I visited her alone, she'd squeeze my hand 3 times, our signal. Stay strong. The pressure increased daily. Rogerio started hosting family meetings where he'd present restructuring plans, suggesting we modernize the brand and increase liquidity, corporate speak for selling assets and extracting cash. My mother played the emotional angle, talking about healing old wounds and giving her a chance to be part of the legacy she'd been unfairly excluded from. "I'm still her daughter," she said one evening, tears that might have been real sliding down her perfectly made-up face. "I know we've had our differences, but blood is blood, Clara. Don't you think I deserve a place at this table?" "You had a place," I replied carefully. "You chose to leave it." Her expression hardened for just a moment before the mask of maternal concern slipped back into place. "I made mistakes, I was young, but I'm here now, aren't I? Doesn't that count for something?" What she didn't say was louder than what she did, and I'm not leaving without my share. They brought lawyers, not the family lawyers who'd served my grandmother for decades, but new ones, sharp-suited men who talked about equitable distribution and legal precedents and potential challenges to the will. "We're not trying to fight anyone," Rogerio assured me, his hand on my shoulder in a gesture that was meant to be paternal, but felt like ownership. "We're just making sure everyone's interests are protected, including yours." But late at night, when they thought I was asleep, I'd hear them talking in the guest wing. Their voices carried through the old house's ventilation system, every word reaching my room as clearly as if they were whispering directly into my ear. "The girl's stubborn," Rogerio muttered. "She actually believes all that legacy nonsense the old woman fed her." "She'll come around," my mother replied. "Or we'll find another way. That testament was written before Victoria lost her faculties. We have grounds to contest it based on diminished capacity. And if that doesn't work," a pause, then we make sure Clara understands that fighting us would be unpleasant, expensive, lonely. Better to settle, take what she's offered, and move on with her life." My hands clenched in the darkness. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I stayed silent, listening, learning. My grandmother had taught me that the most important battles are fought in silence, that the loudest voice rarely wins, that patience is a weapon sharpened by time. The next day I visited her in the hospital. Her eyes found mine immediately, questioning. I squeezed her hand 3 times. "I understand." She squeezed back 4 times. A new signal. Trust the plan. What plan? I wanted to ask. But her lawyer, her real lawyer, the one who'd drafted the testament, was already there, sitting in the corner of the room with a folder identical to the one she'd given me. "Miss Ashford," he said formally, though we'd known each other for years, "your grandmother has asked me to prepare for a family meeting. All parties present. She wants to address the concerns about the estate before it's too late." "When?" "Friday evening. You're home. She's insisting on being there in person, despite the doctor's protests." I looked at my grandmother. Her expression was serene, but her eyes blazed with something I recognized from every business negotiation I'd ever witnessed her conduct. Justice was coming, and it would be delivered in silence, precision, and irrefutable truth. The house became a stage, and everyone was acting except me. I watched them perform their roles with the detached fascination of someone observing a play they'd read the script for, but that the actors believed was improvisation. Rogerio spent his days in the study, my grandmother's study, making phone calls to business associates and spreading papers across her desk like he was already running the empire. He'd found her private files, the ones she kept in the mahogany cabinet, and went through them with the enthusiasm of a treasure hunter. What he didn't know was that my grandmother had learned long ago to keep 2 sets of files. The real ones were somewhere he'd never think to look. My mother transformed into a version of herself I barely recognized, or perhaps one I'd always known existed beneath the surface. She wandered the mansion cataloguing items, making lists on her tablet, occasionally holding up a vase or painting and murmuring appreciatively as if she were already mentally selling it. "This is Venetian glass, isn't it?" she asked me one afternoon, holding a blue vase that my grandmother had purchased on her first trip to Europe, a celebration of her first successful year in business, probably worth quite a bit. "It's worth what it meant to her," I replied. She smiled, brittle and bright. "Sentimentality is expensive, darling. Sometimes we have to choose between meaning and value. Maybe that's why you left, I said quietly. You chose value. Her smile fractured. For just a moment I saw something real beneath it. Hurt, maybe, or shame, but it disappeared so quickly I might have imagined it. At night, I'd hear them plotting. The ventilation system became my secret informant, carrying their voices through the walls like witnesses giving testimony. The document she gave Clara is outdated, Rogerio said on Wednesday night. I spoke to Mitchell. He says with the right legal team, we can argue that Victoria wasn't competent when she revised it. She was already showing signs of decline. But Clara was there, she'll testify otherwise. Clara is 24 and has no legal expertise. We bring medical experts, psychiatric evaluations, testimony from staff about Victoria's confusion in her final months. She wasn't confused. She was dying. But she was sharp until the stroke. Perception is reality in court, Helena. We create the narrative. We control the outcome. He paused. And if necessary, we settle with Clara. Give her enough to feel secure but not enough to be independent. Keep her tied to us, to our decisions. She won't agree to that. Then we make things difficult enough that she has no choice. I lay in bed listening to them, my grandmother's words echoing in my memory. The people who call you a gold digger are always searching for gold themselves. Thursday morning, my grandmother's lawyer called me. Miss Ashford, there's something you need to see. Can you come to my office? What is it? Something your grandmother prepared. She wanted you to have it before the meeting tomorrow. I drove to his office in the city, our sleek high-rise overlooking the financial district. His conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a view of the skyline my grandmother had helped build. 3 of those buildings bore Ashford Resort properties. He slid a folder across the table. It was thick, heavy, filled with documents that had the organized precision of a prepared legal case. Your grandmother has been documenting everything, he explained. For years, every conversation with Helena and Rogerio, every financial request, every manipulation. She hired private investigators 3 years ago when they first started circling, when she realized their interest in reconciliation coincided suspiciously with a business magazine article about her net worth. I opened the folder. Inside were transcripts of recorded phone calls, bank statements showing unexplained transfers, emails between Rogerio and business associates discussing ways to access the Ashford assets through family channels, text messages between him and my mother planning their approach. This one's particularly interesting, the lawyer said, pointing to a highlighted section. 6 months ago, Rogerio attempted to forge your grandmother's signature on a document transferring partial ownership of the resort in Morocco. The attempt failed because the bank flagged the inconsistency, but he tried. My hand shook as I read. Page after page of evidence, of calculated manipulation, of a plan that had been years in the making. She knew, I whispered. All this time, she knew. She suspected, he corrected. She hoped she was wrong. But she also prepared for the possibility that she was right. Victoria didn't build an empire by being naive, Miss Ashford. She built it by being prepared. Why didn't she confront them? Because confrontation gives them warning. Defense gives them time to create counter-narratives. Your grandmother wanted indisputable truth, not a he-said-she-said battle. He leaned forward. Tomorrow's meeting isn't about reading a will. It's about presenting evidence. She wants them to know definitively that they were caught, that their gold digging was documented, traceable, and legally indefensible. But she's dying. Yes, his expression softened, which is why she wants to do this herself. She wants to see it. She wants them to know that she knew, that you knew, that their final act of manipulation failed. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked the mansion's halls, running my fingers along walls that held decades of memories. I stood in my grandmother's office, breathing in the smell of old books and coffee that lingered even in her absence. On her desk was a photograph I'd seen 1,000 times, but never really looked at. Her at 25, standing in front of her first property, exhausted and triumphant and terrifyingly young. She'd built all of this, every stone, every success, every sacrifice. And they wanted to take it, not through work or vision or sacrifice of their own, but through manipulation and false tears and legal maneuvering. My phone buzzed. A message from the hospital. She's asking for you. I drove through empty streets, arriving at 2 a.m. to find my grandmother awake, her eyes clearer than they'd been in days. Tomorrow, she managed to say, each word an effort. I know, I saw the folder. She squeezed my hand. Not revenge, Then what? Truth. She paused, gathering strength. They called you gold digger. Let them see. Real one. What if it breaks her? She's still your daughter. My grandmother's eyes filled with something that might have been sadness, but looked more like resignation. Already to broken. Not your job to fix. Another squeeze. Your job. Protect legacy, protect truth. I will. I know. She smiled. Slight, but real. That's why you inherit. Not because you stayed. Because you would have stayed. Even if nothing to inherit. I stayed with her until dawn, holding her hand, preparing for the battle that would be fought with documents and truth and the quiet devastation of irrefutable evidence. Justice, I was learning, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was the sound of a folder opening. Sometimes it was the silence after a truth was spoken. Sometimes it was the look on someone's face when they realized the person they'd underestimated had been watching all along. Friday evening arrived with the weight of inevitability. The dining room had been transformed into something between a family gathering and a tribunal. The long mahogany table gleamed under carefully positioned lighting. Lawyers sat at one end, my grandmother's chosen witnesses at the other, including Margaret, her assistant of 30 years, and Thomas, the financial advisor who'd helped her build the empire from that single beachfront property. My mother and Rogerio arrived dressed for victory. She wore cream silk, expensive and elegant. He wore navy cashmere with gold cufflinks that caught the light like warnings. They settled into their chairs with the confidence of people who believed the game was already won. I sat in silence, my hands folded in my lap, the black folder in front of me untouched. My grandmother arrived last, brought by medical transport against explicit doctor's orders. She looked frail in her wheelchair, wrapped in a cashmere blanket, but her eyes were sharp as cut diamonds. The nurse positioned her at the head of the table, her rightful place, and stepped back. "Thank you all for coming," my grandmother's lawyer began, his voice formal. "We're here to discuss the disposition of Victoria Ashford's estate, as outlined in her testament, and to address concerns raised by family members regarding said disposition." Rogerio leaned forward immediately. "Before we begin, I want to state for the record that our concerns aren't motivated by greed. We're simply advocating for fairness. Helena is Victoria's biological daughter and deserves recognition in the inheritance structure." "Recognition in the form of what percentage?" the lawyer asked calmly. "A third," my mother said quickly. "Clara can have a third, I receive a third, and the remaining third goes into a trust managed collectively." "Collectively meaning by you and Mr. Santos. We're proposing professional management, yes?" My grandmother's hand moved slightly on the arm of her wheelchair. The signal for me to begin. I opened the black folder slowly, deliberately. Every eye in the room tracked the movement. "Before we discuss management," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I think we should discuss loyalty." "Loyalty?" Rogerio's eyebrow arched. "Interesting word choice from someone who's been called a gold digger by half the family." "Yes," I agreed. "Interesting that those accusations came primarily from you and my mother. People with no financial stake in the empire, no involvement in its operations, and no contact with my grandmother for years, until a business magazine published an article estimating the Ashford estate's worth at $340 million. The room temperature seemed to drop. My mother's expression flickered. "That's not," she started. "Let me finish." I pulled out the first document. 3 years ago, immediately following that article's publication, my mother called my grandmother for the first time in 18 months. She suggested a reconciliation dinner. During that dinner, Rogerio presented a proposal for what he called family integration in business decisions. My grandmother declined. I laid the document on the table, a transcript of a recorded conversation. My grandmother had recorded everything. 2 years ago, Rogerio attempted to access my grandmother's accounts by claiming he had power of attorney. He presented forged documents to 3 separate banks. All attempts were flagged and reported. Rogerio stood abruptly. "This is absurd. Who recorded these?" "My grandmother," I said simply. "She recorded everything, every call, every visit, every proposal. She wanted documentation, not because she was paranoid, but because she'd built an empire by understanding the difference between family and opportunists." I pulled out more documents, spreading them across the table like playing cards in a game where only one person knew the winning hand. 18 months ago, you and my mother hired a lawyer to research grounds for contesting a will based on diminished capacity. The consultation emails are here. My mother's face had gone pale. We were just exploring options. 6 months ago, Rogerio forged my grandmother's signature on a property transfer document. The forgery was caught, but the attempt was documented. That was a misunderstanding. 3 months ago, you contacted 5 of my grandmother's business partners, suggesting they prepare for transition and offering your services as interim management before my grandmother had any medical crisis. The documents kept coming. Bank statements showing Rogerio's debts, text messages between him and my mother discussing strategic positioning, emails to lawyers, to financial advisors, to potential buyers of assets my grandmother still owned. My grandmother's lawyer spoke next, his tone clinical. What's clear from this evidence is a pattern of attempted access, manipulation, and planning to extract assets from the Ashford estate through any means necessary. Legal challenge, forgery or manipulation of Victoria during a vulnerable period. This is character assassination, Rogerio snapped, but his voice had lost its confidence. No, my grandmother said, each word slow but clear. Truth, she gestured, and I pulled out the final document. Her original testament sealed and dated, with the revision clause. Read the clause, my grandmother instructed. I read aloud. The full inheritance of the Ashford estate, including all properties, investments and assets, shall pass to the individual who demonstrates loyalty, integrity and commitment to the family legacy, not through blood claim, but through proven action. Said individual must not have engaged in any attempts to manipulate, deceive or extract assets from the estate during the testator's lifetime. The silence was absolute. The inheritance, the lawyer continued, passes entirely to Clara Ashford. Helena Santos, formerly Ashford, and Rogerio Santos are explicitly excluded based on documented evidence of attempted manipulation and fraud. My mother's composure shattered. You can't do this. I'm your daughter. You are, my grandmother said, her voice gaining strength. Until you chose money over me, over Clara, over truth. We needed, Rogerio started. You needed nothing, I interrupted. You wanted, you schemed. You came to a dying woman's home and planned to rob her while she was still breathing. Clara, please. My mother's tears were real now, but whether from shame or rage or loss, I couldn't tell. We're family. Family doesn't do what you did, I said quietly. Family doesn't forge signatures, doesn't hire lawyers to declare someone mentally incompetent while they're still sharp enough to record your every conversation, doesn't look at a dying woman and see a bank account. My grandmother raised her hand, silencing the room. They called her gold digger. But gold diggers, are you? Clara stayed, because she loved. You came, because you smelled inheritance. This won't hold up in court, Rogerio blustered, but his face had gone grey. Actually, the lawyer said pleasantly, it will. We have recordings, documents, witness testimony and evidence of attempted fraud. You're welcome to challenge it. But I should mention that doing so will result in the full evidence being presented publicly, including the forged documents which constitute criminal fraud. The threat hung in the air. My mother looked at Rogerio. Rogerio looked at his lawyers. The lawyers looked at the documents spread across the table and slowly, almost imperceptibly, shook their heads. It was over. You should leave, I said softly. Both of you. Tonight. Clara. My mother reached for my hand. I pulled away. You called me a gold digger for 5 years. Every family gathering, every rare visit, every phone call. You said I was manipulating her, using her, staying close for the money. And all the while you were the ones with spreadsheets calculating inheritance, with lawyers on retainer, with plans to extract every dollar you could. I'm sorry, she whispered. You're sorry you got caught. I stood, my legs shaking but my voice steady. You're sorry the recordings existed. You're sorry the evidence was documented. But you're not sorry for what you did. And that's why you're leaving. My grandmother watched them go, her expression unreadable. As the door closed behind them, as their footsteps faded down the hallway, she reached for my hand. You didn't cry, she observed. I'll cry later, I promised. Right now I'm just relieved it's over. Not over, beginning. She was right, of course. The empire was mine now. The legacy, the responsibility, the weight of decisions that would affect hundreds of employees and thousands of guests. But also the freedom, the truth, the peace of knowing I'd earned it not through blood or manipulation, but through loyalty when loyalty was tested, through silence when silence was wisdom, through love when love was all that remained. They'd called me a gold digger, but I'd inherited something they could never steal: integrity. The aftermath of truth is always strange. After the lawyers left, after the witnesses departed, after the nurse took my grandmother back to the medical transport, the house felt different. The same walls, the same rooms, but emptied of lies and therefore somehow larger, like a space that had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. I didn't sleep that night. I wandered the mansion like a ghost, touching surfaces, standing in doorways, processing what had happened. My mother and Rogerio had packed with the frantic efficiency of people fleeing a crime scene. They'd been gone within 2 hours, their expensive luggage rolling across marble floors that would no longer welcome them. My mother had tried one last time in the foyer, her hand on my arm. "You don't understand what it's like," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "To build a life, and then realize you're running out of time, running out of money, running out of options. We weren't trying to hurt anyone. You were trying to steal from a dying woman," I said simply. "There's no version of that story where you're the victim. She had so much, we just wanted. What you wanted was never yours. That's the part you can't seem to understand. She built it. It was hers to give or not give, and she chose based on who actually loved her, not who showed up when the inheritance was being counted." She flinched like I'd struck her. Maybe I had, but with truth instead of violence. Rogerio had abandoned pretense entirely. His charm had evaporated, leaving only bitterness. "You think you're so righteous," he said, as they stood by the door, suitcases at their feet. "But you're just as calculating as you accused us of being. You stayed for this, for the money." "I stayed because she was my grandmother and I loved her. The fact that you can't comprehend that motive says everything about you and nothing about me. We'll challenge this. The recordings might not be admissible. We have grounds." "You have nothing," I interrupted. "You have debts that the investigators found, business failures you hid, and a pattern of behavior that looks like fraud to any objective observer. Challenge it if you want, but know that every piece of evidence will become public record. Every forgery, every scheme, every calculated manipulation will be part of court documents that journalists will have access to." His jaw worked, rage and calculation warring in his expression. But my grandmother's lawyer had been clear. Fighting would expose them far more than it would benefit them. They left without another word. I stood in the empty foyer afterward, listening to the silence. Margaret found me there an hour later, standing in the dark. "Miss Clara, are you all right?" "I don't know," I admitted. "She's my mother. I just cut her out of my life completely." "She cut herself out years ago, dear. You just made it official. It doesn't feel like justice. It feels like sadness." Margaret, who'd worked for my grandmother since before I was born, who'd watched our family fracture and reform and fracture again, put her arm around my shoulders. "Justice and sadness aren't mutually exclusive. You can be right and still grieve. You can protect yourself and still feel the loss." She paused. "Your grandmother knew that. It's why she was sad when she revealed everything, even though she knew it was necessary. How did it get to this point? How do people you share blood with become strangers?" "Slowly," Margaret said. "One choice at a time. One compromise of values. One decision to prioritize want over integrity. Your mother didn't wake up one day and decide to be cruel. She made small choices that accumulated into large betrayals. And your grandmother didn't wake up one day and decide to disinherit her daughter. She watched, waited, hoped it would change. But hope isn't the same as delusion." The next morning brought consequences. Rogerio's attempt to contest the will lasted exactly one meeting with a reputable law firm. When presented with the evidence my grandmother had compiled, his lawyers advised him to withdraw immediately or face potential criminal charges for the forged documents. My mother tried a different approach: public sympathy. She gave an interview to a society magazine, painting herself as a grieving daughter, cut off by a manipulative granddaughter. "Clara poisoned my mother against me," she claimed. "She isolated her, controlled her access to family, and convinced her to leave everything to someone barely out of college." The article circulated for exactly 2 days before my grandmother's lawyer released a statement. Not combative, just factual. Mrs. Santos's claims are demonstrably false, as evidenced by dated recordings, third-party witnesses, and documented attempts at financial fraud. We have refrained from releasing this evidence publicly out of respect for family privacy, but we will not allow defamatory statements to go unchallenged. The threat was clear: push harder, and everything becomes public. The article disappeared from the magazine's website within hours. My mother's social media went silent. 3 weeks after the reading of the testament, I received a letter, not from my mother but from Rogerio's lawyer, a formal notice that they were dropping all challenges and would not pursue further legal action. It was over. Truly, finally over. But my grandmother was fading. I spent every day at the hospital, sitting beside her bed, sometimes talking, sometimes just holding her hand in silence. She'd drift in and out of consciousness, but when she was awake, she was present in a way that made every moment feel sacred. "You're free now," she said one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't feel free. I feel like I'm losing you." "Not losing. Releasing." She squeezed my hand weakly. I held on, to make sure, to see you protected. "Now, my work is done." "Don't say that." "Clara." Her eyes focused on mine with sudden intensity. "Don't be afraid of what comes next. You're ready. You've always been ready." A pause. "The empire isn't the inheritance. The strength is. I don't know if I'm strong enough. You faced your mother, faced lies, faced people who wanted to destroy you, and you didn't scream, didn't break, didn't compromise." She smiled faintly. "That's strength. Not the absence of fear, the presence of conviction." I pressed my forehead to her hand, tears finally coming. All the grief I'd held back during the confrontation, all the sadness I'd armored myself against, all the loss I'd been too busy being strong to feel, it crashed over me in waves. "I don't want to do this without you." "You won't. I'll be in every decision, every choice, every moment you choose integrity over ease." She died 3 days later, peacefully, in the early morning light. I was there, holding her hand, watching the sun rise through the hospital window and paint everything gold. Margaret had once told me that my grandmother loved sunrises because they represented possibility, the chance to build something new with each day. Watching that last sunrise with her, I understood. She wasn't ending. She was transforming, becoming part of the legacy she'd built, part of the foundation I'd stand on. The funeral was everything she'd wanted. Simple, elegant, attended by people who'd known her as a builder, an employer, a visionary, not by people who saw her as an inheritance opportunity. My mother and Rogerio didn't come. I hadn't expected them to. Standing at the graveside, listening to the eulogies from employees who'd worked for her for decades, from business partners who'd built empires alongside her, from community leaders whose towns had been transformed by her resorts, I realized something profound. She'd won. Not the battle with my mother. That had been a sad necessity, not a victory. But the bigger war, the fight to ensure her legacy survived intact, protected by someone who understood that empires aren't built on greed, but on vision, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. Thomas, her financial advisor, approached me after the service. "Your grandmother left instructions for you about what to do next." "More instructions? Not commands. Advice. She wanted you to know you don't have to do things exactly as she did. The empire is yours now. Your vision, your decisions, your legacy to build." He handed me an envelope. "But she also wanted you to have this." Inside was a letter, written in her shaking hand during one of her last conscious hours. "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Don't mourn too long. I lived fully, built greatly, and died knowing my life's work was in hands I trusted absolutely. The empire is yours, but don't let it own you. I built it because I had something to prove, to myself, to a world that told me I couldn't. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You already did by being exactly who you are when others tried to make you someone else. Change what needs changing. Sell what doesn't serve your vision. Build new things. The name Ashford means excellence, but you define what excellence means for your generation. They called you a gold digger. Let history call you something better. A woman who inherited power and used it wisely. I love you. I'm proud of you. And I'm grateful every day that I got to know the woman you became. Build something beautiful, my darling. That's the only inheritance that matters. Victoria. I folded the letter carefully, tucking it into my jacket pocket right over my heart. Around me, people lingered, sharing stories about my grandmother, laughing through tears at memories of her sharp wit, her impossible standards, her unexpected kindness. This was the real inheritance. Not the money, not the properties, not the empire itself. The legacy of being someone worth remembering. Someone who built something that improved lives. Someone who faced manipulators with truth and emerged victorious, not through cruelty, but through preparation. They'd called me a gold digger, but I'd inherited something gold could never buy. A name that meant something. Earned through loyalty, proven through adversity, and now carried forward with purpose. The empire was mine, the responsibility was mine. The future was mine to build, and I would build it worthy of the woman who'd believed in me when everyone else only saw what they could take. The mansion felt different the morning after the funeral. Not empty exactly, but expectant. Like a theater between performances. The stage set, but waiting for the next act to begin. I woke early, a habit I'd learned from my grandmother, who believed the best decisions were made when the world was still quiet. The sun was just beginning to paint the horizon pink and gold as I made coffee in the kitchen, using her old silver pot, the one she'd brought from her first apartment decades ago. The house staff had asked if I wanted them to clear out her bedroom. I'd said no, not yet. Some transitions require time, not efficiency. Margaret found me on the terrace, watching the ocean in the distance. My grandmother had positioned the house specifically for this view. She'd told me once that she needed to see the horizon every morning, to remind herself that there was always something beyond what she'd already built. "You look like her," Margaret observed, setting down a tray with fresh pastries. Standing there like that. She used to stand in that exact spot every morning. Did she ever doubt herself? Every day. Margaret smiled. Margaret. But she did it anyway. That was her secret, you know. Not fearlessness. Courage despite fear. We sat in companionable silence for a while, eating breakfast, watching the world wake up. Eventually, Margaret spoke again. "The board meeting is scheduled for next week. They'll want to know your plans." "I know. Do you have any?" I pulled out my grandmother's letter, reading it again. "Change what needs changing. Build new things. You define what excellence means for your generation." "I have ideas," I said slowly, "but I need to understand the full scope first. Everything she built, every property, every investment. I need to know not just what exists, but why it exists. Her reasoning, her vision." She left detailed notes in her office, files on every property, every decision, every strategy. Of course she had. My grandmother had built her empire on meticulous planning and documentation. Why would her final gift to me be any different? I spent the next week living in that office, surrounded by decades of business decisions, reading her notes, studying her reasoning, understanding the empire I'd inherited not as a static thing, but as a living organism that had grown, adapted, and evolved. The Ashford Resort Collection consisted of 15 properties across 3 continents. Each one had been chosen with specific intention, not just for profit but for impact. She'd built in communities that needed economic development, had hired locally, had created programs that educated and elevated her employees. One file particularly caught my attention, a property in Morocco she'd purchased 5 years ago but never developed. The notes explained why. The local community had concerns about tourism's impact on their traditional way of life. My grandmother had bought the land to prevent a less ethical developer from building there, then had spent years in dialogue with community leaders, trying to design something that would benefit everyone. She'd died before finding the solution. I stared at that file for hours, thinking about what she'd written. True luxury isn't about imposing your vision. It's about creating spaces that honor the people and places that host them. That became my first decision. The board meeting came. 15 people around a table, all of them older than me, all of them with more experience, all of them watching me with varying degrees of skepticism, curiosity, or concern. Thomas introduced me formally, though everyone knew who I was. The question wasn't my identity, it was my capability. "I know what you're thinking," I began, standing at the head of the table, my grandmother's position. "I'm 24, I have a degree in architecture, not business. I've never run a company, never managed a portfolio of this size, never made decisions that affect hundreds of employees and millions in revenue." Nods around the table. At least they were honest. "You're right to be concerned, I would be too." I pulled out the Morocco file. "But I've spent the last week studying not just what my grandmother built, but how and why she built it. And I've realized something important. She didn't succeed because she followed conventional wisdom. She succeeded because she saw opportunities where others saw risk, because she valued long-term vision over short-term profit, because she understood that the best businesses don't extract value from communities, they create it." I laid out my proposal for Morocco, a partnership with local artisans and community leaders, a resort designed to showcase traditional craftsmanship, with revenue sharing that would fund education and infrastructure in the surrounding villages. Not charity, investment. Not tourism that consumed culture, but tourism that preserved and celebrated it. "This is the kind of project that takes years to see return," one board member pointed out. "Yes, just like the beachfront property in California. that everyone told my grandmother was a terrible investment. Just like the resort in Indonesia that people said would never work. Just like every single property that's now generating millions in annual revenue. I met his eyes steadily. My grandmother played the long game. So will I. Another board member, Sarah Chen, who'd worked with my grandmother for 20 years, smiled slightly. What else? I want to create a foundation, the Ashford Legacy Foundation. It will focus on supporting women entrepreneurs in hospitality and real estate. Grants, mentorship, training programs. We'll fund it with 5% of annual profits. That's a significant commitment, the CFO noted. Yes, it's also exactly the kind of thing my grandmother would have done if she'd had more time. She built this empire from nothing. She knew what it meant to face a world that didn't believe a woman could succeed in this industry. This foundation ensures other women don't face the same barriers. The room was quiet. Then Thomas spoke. Victoria once told me that she hoped you'd be brave enough to make the empire your own, not just maintain what she'd built. I think she'd be proud of what I'm hearing. The vote was unanimous. The Morocco project was approved. The foundation was approved, and I was confirmed as CEO with Thomas as advisor and Sarah as COO. Walking out of that boardroom, I felt something shift inside me. Not confidence exactly, but purpose. Certainty that this was what I was meant to do, even if I had no idea yet how to do all of it. That evening, I returned to the hospital chapel where we'd held my grandmother's memorial. It was empty now, quiet except for the distant sound of medical equipment and hushed conversations in the halls. I sat in the front pew, in the same spot I'd sat during her service, and allowed myself to feel everything I'd been too busy to process. The grief, yes, but also the gratitude. The fear, but also the excitement. The weight of responsibility, but also the privilege of carrying forward something meaningful. I don't know if you can hear me, I said quietly to the empty chapel, but if you can, I want you to know I'm not going to do everything exactly like you did. You told me not to, but I'm going to try to do it with the same integrity, the same vision, the same commitment to building something that matters. The chapel was silent. No divine intervention, no supernatural sign, just the ordinary quiet of a sacred space. But somehow, that felt like enough, like permission, like blessing. I left the hospital and drove to the beachfront property my grandmother had purchased all those years ago. The one everyone had said was cursed, the one that became the foundation of the empire. It was late evening now, the sun setting over the ocean, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. Standing on the beach, feeling sand beneath my feet, I understood something my grandmother had tried to teach me. Legacies aren't preserved by making them museums. They're honored by making them living things that grow, change, and adapt, while keeping their core values intact. They'd called me a gold digger. They'd said I'd manipulated my grandmother, isolated her, stolen what should have been shared. But standing there, watching the sun set on my first day as CEO of the empire she'd built, I knew the truth. I hadn't stolen anything. I'd earned it. Through loyalty when it wasn't convenient, through love when it wasn't profitable, through presence when others chose absence. And now I would prove that the best inheritance isn't what you receive, it's what you build with what you've been given. The sun slipped below the horizon, the world turned dark. Then the stars emerged, and I walked back to my car ready to begin. 5 years later, I stood in the lobby of the Morocco property on opening day. The resort had taken longer than projected. Good things usually do, but it was perfect. Local artisans had carved intricate patterns into the woodwork. Textiles from village cooperatives adorned every room. The restaurant featured chefs from surrounding communities, serving traditional dishes alongside contemporary cuisine. But what I was proudest of wasn't visible in the architecture. It was in the faces of the staff. 70% local hires, many of them women who'd gone through our training program. It was in the partnership agreements that ensured profits flowed back into community infrastructure. It was in the school we'd funded 2 miles away, where children learned traditional crafts alongside modern business skills. Sarah Chen stood beside me, watching guests arrive for the soft opening. Your grandmother would have loved this. She started it. I just finished it. No, you transformed it. She bought land to prevent exploitation. You turned it into a model for how tourism can elevate rather than extract. That's your vision, not hers. She was right, though it had taken me years to see the difference. My grandmother had taught me the foundation: integrity, vision, long-term thinking. But the specific expression of those values, that was mine to determine. The Ashford Legacy Foundation had awarded its first grants 3 years ago. We'd funded 18 women entrepreneurs so far, helping them start boutique hotels, consulting firms, design studios. 2 had already become profitable enough to fund the next generation themselves. The ripple effect my grandmother had always talked about. The empire had grown, but not in the ways people expected. We'd sold 2 properties that didn't align with our values anymore, massive resorts built in my grandmother's early days when profit was the primary motive. We'd downsized deliberately, focusing on quality over quantity, on impact over expansion. Wall Street analysts had called it a mistake. Our stock price had dipped initially, but then something interesting happened. Guests started seeking us out specifically because of our values. Employees stayed longer, worked harder, became ambassadors for the brand. Communities welcomed us instead of resisting us, and profitability, it turned out, followed purpose. We were making less money than we could have through pure extraction, but we were building something sustainable, something that would last beyond quarterly earnings reports. I'd learned to lead not by imitating my grandmother, but by understanding what made her effective and translating those principles through my own lens. She'd been a force of nature, commanding, certain, sometimes intimidating. I was quieter, more collaborative, more willing to admit uncertainty. Both approaches could work. The key was authenticity. My mother reached out once, 2 years after everything fell apart. An email, not a call. Carefully worded, apologetic, but also defensive. She wanted to know if we could find a path forward, if I'd consider healing old wounds. I'd stared at that email for 3 days before responding. My reply was brief. I forgive you for my own peace, not as an invitation back into my life. I hope you find whatever you're looking for, but you won't find it in this family's resources. Take care of yourself. She never responded. I never expected her to. Forgiveness, I'd learned, didn't require reconciliation. I could release the anger without opening the door. I could wish her well without funding her lifestyle. I could acknowledge she was my mother without pretending we were family in any meaningful sense. It was complicated. Grief usually is, but it was also freeing. I'd spent too many years carrying the weight of her choices, trying to understand how a mother could prioritize money over her daughter, trying to fix something that had broken long before I was old enough to recognize it. Now I understood. Some things aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be learned from, grieved, and released. Standing in that Moroccan lobby, watching staff members greet guests in 3 languages, watching traditional musicians set up in the courtyard, watching centuries-old craftsmanship showcase alongside modern luxury, I felt something I'd never quite felt before. Belonging. Not to a place, but to a purpose. My phone buzzed. A message from Margaret. Your grandmother's anniversary is tomorrow. I've arranged flowers for the grave. Will you be back? I would be. Every year on the anniversary of her death, I visited her grave and spent an hour just sitting there, talking to her about the year's decisions, the challenges, the victories, asking for advice I'd have to imagine, seeking approval I'd never hear, but that was okay. Leadership meant making decisions in uncertainty. It meant being comfortable with ambiguity. It meant understanding that you'd never have all the answers, never be completely sure, never eliminate the risk of failure. My grandmother had known that. She'd failed plenty, investments that didn't work out, properties that struggled, decisions that looked brilliant on paper but terrible in practice. The difference was that she learned from failures instead of being destroyed by them, adjusted course instead of doubling down on mistakes. I was learning to do the same. A young woman approached me, hesitant but determined. She wore a staff uniform, her name tag identifying her as Amina, front desk manager. Miss Ashford, I wanted to thank you for the training program, for giving me this opportunity. 5 years ago, I was cleaning hotel rooms in Marrakesh. Now I'm managing a resort. My daughter, she paused, emotion flooding her voice. My daughter says she wants to be like me when she grows up. Like you, a woman who builds things. I felt tears prick my eyes. This was the inheritance that mattered. Thank you for trusting us, I said. And thank you for proving that excellence has nothing to do with where you start, and everything to do with determination and opportunity meeting each other. She smiled, nodded, and returned to her post. Sarah caught my expression. You okay? Better than okay. I watched Amina greet a guest with confidence and warmth. I'm watching the legacy expand. That night, alone in my suite overlooking the Atlas Mountains, I pulled out my grandmother's letter, the one I'd carried with me for 5 years, rereading whenever I doubted myself. Build something beautiful, my darling. That's the only inheritance that matters. I'd built something beautiful. not perfect. Perfection was an illusion, but meaningful, sustainable, values-driven, something that employed people, elevated communities, and proved that business could be both profitable and purposeful. They'd called me a gold digger. They'd said I'd manipulated my grandmother, stolen an inheritance, didn't deserve what I'd been given. But 5 years later, the evidence spoke louder than accusations ever could. The empire was stronger, the staff was more diverse, the communities were more prosperous, the foundation was changing lives, and my grandmother's name, the Ashford name, meant something beyond wealth. It meant integrity. I fell asleep that night with mountain air flowing through open windows, with the distant sound of traditional music drifting up from the village, with the peaceful certainty that comes from knowing you've honored a legacy while building your own. The next morning, I flew home for my grandmother's anniversary. The grave was simple. She'd insisted on that. Just her name, her years, and a single line. She built with vision and led with integrity. I placed fresh flowers beside Margaret's arrangement and sat on the grass, letting the silence speak. I kept my promise, I said quietly. I built something beautiful, not just maintained what you created, but grew it in ways that align with who I am, not just who you were. I hope you'd approve. The wind stirred the trees. Birds sang overhead. The world continued its ordinary business while I sat with extraordinary grief and equally extraordinary gratitude. They still call me a gold digger sometimes, I admitted. Usually people who've never built anything themselves, who don't understand the difference between inheriting money and inheriting responsibility. But I've learned something. Let them talk. Legacy isn't about what people say. It's about what you build, who you help, and what remains after you're gone. I stood brushing grass from my jeans, preparing to leave, but I turned back one more time. Thank you for seeing me when others only saw what they could take, for trusting me with something you spent your lifetime building, for teaching me that the best revenge isn't cruelty, it's success with integrity. I walked back to my car, back to the empire, back to the work that would never truly be finished because excellence is a practice, not a destination. They called me a gold digger, but I inherited something gold could never buy, the knowledge that true wealth isn't what you accumulate. It's what you build that outlasts you. It's the lives you change. It's the integrity you maintain when compromise would be easier. It's the legacy you leave that inspires others to build their own. And in the end, that inheritance, the one measured in impact rather than dollars, in purpose rather than profit, in meaning rather than money, that's the only one worth protecting. That's the only one worth fighting for. That's the only one that makes you truly rich. So tell me, where are you listening from? What city? What country? Have you ever been called a gold digger by someone who wanted what was yours? Have you ever had to prove your worth to people who'd already decided you were worthless? Have you ever inherited something? Money, responsibility, reputation, pain, and had to decide whether to maintain it or transform it into something better? Leave your story in the comments. This video is for everyone who learned to win in silence, who chose integrity when manipulation would have been easier, who built something meaningful while others only knew how to take. Your location, your story, your truth. Because somewhere in the world right now, someone needs to know they're not alone in fighting battles that leave no visible scars, in inheriting legacies that come with both gifts and burdens, in being called names by people who'll never understand what it means to actually earn something. Tell me where you're from. Tell me your story. Let's build a community of people who understand that the real gold isn't what you dig up, it's what you create.